Okay guys, so now we are back with our Know Your Tools module of our sewing course. I hope you guys are learning some new things as we continue to go along in our fourth lesson. So as you may notice, I've got a little bit more hair and a lot more to teach you guys. So we're going to get started in this week's module, Know Your Tools. And I'm basically going to go through all the tools that are required for you to be a successful sewer and sew at a high level. So that's what we're going to get into today. I hope you guys were able to accumulate a couple of things. If not, don't worry about it. Again, you have access to this course. You can go back anytime, over time, see what tools you need right now, see what tools you may want to hold off to for a little bit later. I just wanted to show you guys just some of the things that I've accumulated over the years that I have been sewing. Certain things you'll see in the book that I actually do not use because I found that it hasn't been something that's been useful to me. And there may be one or two things that you don't see within the materials or the book that I actually use because I found it to be quite useful. So let's get on with it. So to start off, I wanted to get everyone familiar with some of the books that I use to aid me in creating these lessons. So one of the books that I use is the Dressmaking book, and it's by Allison Smith. And what I enjoy about this book is it has a lot of useful information specifically for just dressmaking. So I use this book along with her other book, which is the sewing book. And they're pretty much the same, except for the dressmaking book really just focuses on dressmaking. And that's what I enjoy about this book. The sewing book is kind of just like an overview, variety of different kinds of sewing topics. It includes blankets and pillows. But what I like about this book is it's specifically showcasing specific skills in dressmaking. You'll even see an example here of the pattern for the dress that we'll end up making in our beginner to intermediate course. So you'll sort of see how the pattern starts off, and it just gives basically a lot more additional steps to what we'll be covering. So I encourage you guys to sort of invest in a bit of your own bit of sewing library. It doesn't have to be extensive. Sometimes you'll find books that are more about glossy images and less about actual information, but I found this book to be pretty informational. So I would definitely encourage you to, just like I said, kind of like get your sewing library started just so you had some reference books. By Allison Smith is the sewing book. This is one of my initial sewing books that I purchased for myself to just have reference. And this is what we're going to be using for the basis of our Know Your Tools lesson. So this is what you're going to want to look out for. Again, you have the sewing book by Allison Smith, and then you have her dressmaking book, which is just specifically for dressmaking. So we're going to start off with our basic sewing kit. And as you can see here, you have this in your notes where I just took a picture of this book itself, and it just goes over some of the tools you'll want to start off with if you're starting light and you're just introducing yourself to sewing. You don't want to overwhelm yourself with the tools that are available. So we're going to go down this list, and I'm just going to kind of show you my what I have that I've accumulated for myself, and just what I use and what I don't use, what you may need now and what you may need later. So first we're going to use a thimble, and everybody knows what the thimble is. It's really just a sewing finger guard that you're supposed to use with sewing. And if I'm perfectly honest, I have yet to master how to sew with this. So due to that, my fingers are worn and kind of like scraped up from me just over the years not using this. So if you want to really become like comfortable and don't want to have damaged fingers, then I would suggest initially starting off with practicing sewing, especially hand sewing, using the thimble, because it actually does protect your fingers. Like I said, I never learned how to sew with it, so it's actually quite uncomfortable for me to sew with it. But I'm sure once I get the hang of it, my fingers will be relieved. So that is a thimble. Then we have the standard tape measurer. They come in so many lengths and varieties. I have one that measures, let's see, 120 inches. And that's for sewing larger projects. And then I have the standard one that I often use for my clients and the body. And that goes up to just the 60. So you have 60 inches to 120 inches for your measuring tape, and I have both, just depends on the project. I mainly do dressmaking sewing, so that I would probably use if I was measuring a train or something that had a lot of length to it. So the next one is zippers. The picture they've shown here is like the basic zipper that you would use in more basic designs. I just have tons and tons of invisible zippers. And that's because, like I said, I do dressmaking. Most of my stuff is formal and these are very long. So I just have tons of invisible zippers because that's majority what I use. And as we go on in the lessons, you'll see the difference between an invisible zipper and a regular zipper. Obviously, the goal is to create that invisible seam so that you don't see the teeth showing in the front of the zipper. So that's why I focus mainly on invisible zippers. Okay. The next we have threads. So again, if you're starting out, and we'll get into the threads lesson quite shortly, but if you're starting out, I would say just go basic black and white. These are large spools of serger thread, but you can get smaller spools depending on how comfortable you are. I like to use larger ones only because I don't like to constantly have to return to the store and continuously buy threads over and over. So I just get huge spools. And then I have an attachment at my machine so that it can actually hold the larger spools, which I'll show you shortly when we go to our machines. So just a standard, basic, general purpose thread, black, white, and you can use that for hand sewing and machine sewing. Again, when we get into our thread section, I'll break down the specific types of threads and what they are used for. Next off, we have the book here has notions, and that's just basically the other things that come with creating dresses, and those are your buttons, your snaps, for me, tons of hook and eyes. I also keep my beads in these huge canisters. You guys can see it. And I just separate my different decorative beads, and you can get this from any standard art supply store. And I just have several of these where I keep my beads and those kind of tiny little pieces you want to keep separate. And I also do have one specifically for my bigger embellishments, my buttons, and those bigger things, my hook and eyes. So I have a couple of these and I just keep them stacked on top of each other. And over time, I've accumulated the notions based on the kind of work that I do. Again, I do mostly special occasions work. So a lot of these have to do with sequins, tiny glass beads, cover buttons often used for wedding dresses, hooks, white hook and eye, metallic hook and eye, and different kinds of clasps that I use. And that's because the majority of my work is special occasions. So I have more special occasions designs depending on what kind of work you do, or if you're sewing for yourself, then you would sort of decide what kinds of notions you would accumulate. But that's what notions are, just these decorative additional things that you add to a garment. So next, again, we're going to get more specifically into, but we'll just kind of get a general purpose of pins. So you have the standard glass head pins, and they're just regular pins, usually a color at the top, nothing too crazy, nothing too fancy, just to start you off. And then you also have the dressmaker pins, and they're used for just mostly beginner sewers, and they're general pins that you use and pretty much go into any fabric. Again, we'll get into more detail for dressmaking pins, but this is just kind of a basic sewing kit overview. Next, we have the seam gauge, and this little measuring tool is very useful for when you're measuring, especially when you're doing hand sewing and you're measuring basically smaller lengths. So if you're measuring like a dart length, if you're measuring stitches in between when you're doing a basting stitch, this is just helpful for those smaller measurements where you can't really use a ruler or tape measurer. So this is very helpful for seams when you're just trying to measure smaller seams, usually in the bodice or in the top of the skirt. Okay. Safety pins. Safety pins, I recently started introducing safety pins, and it's made a world of difference, especially when I do my alterations, because you're able to keep the fabrics, more than one piece of fabric together. So for example, if I'm pinning in someone's bodice that I'm going to take in, a straight pin obviously would come out when they're taking the garment off. So the safety pin just allows me to secure it in place so I can go and mark it at another time. So safety pins are also pretty much a necessity when you're talking about building your basic sewing kit. So our next list of things that we need for our sewing kit are needles, of course, standard sharps, nothing too fancy. They have different needle types based on the job you're doing. But if you're just, like I said, talking about basic sewing kit, we're just talking about standard needles, and just have quite a few because you'll lose them like a crazy person. Okay. I have my tiny embroidery scissors. And I use these when I'm cutting small pieces of thread, and also they're easier to handle when you're doing more refined techniques instead of having this huge pair of scissors where it's kind of hard to like navigate. These are perfect for snips, and when you're doing small embroidery clips, they're a lot more easy to handle than your standard scissors that you would use. So these are also quite useful. I also have here this buttonhole cutter. And as you can see here, as they have it in the book, it's just, if you can get a glance of it, it's the sharp edge here at the top, very sharp, and you use it to insert into the hole after you created the outline of a button. So once you create the outline of a button, instead of trying to, wheel your scissors inside of it, and you can end up snipping the fabric, and that's a nightmare. Just use this, and you sort of press it inside of it, and it creates a nice clean button for you. So I definitely encourage you to pick this up as well, especially once you become more familiar with creating buttons. Initially you won't see the point of it, but trust me, once you become more familiar with creating buttons, this will be a lifesaver. You have your pin cushions. This is standard, usually comes in a normal sewing kit. I usually just stick my stray needles inside of here so that I don't lose them if I can't get them back inside the box. I don't use it as often as I use this. And this is the metal or metallic or magnetic rather needle pickup, and this is perfect for many reasons. One, when you're sewing and you don't want to constantly have to go back and forth, or see how it sticks there just like that, or when you inevitably drop pins all over the floor, instead of having to crawl around on your knees to find the pins, you just kind of sweep this over the floor and it picks everything up and it gives your fingers a bit of relief. So I definitely encourage you to get this. The only setback to wearing that is I find, because I do work with a lot of special occasions garments, you can't really go under fabrics, because if you have pins all over your arm, and you're gonna snag some of those very fine fabrics. So it's kind of like a catch-22 with that one. Okay, obviously the seam ripper, I have more than one of these. I have this longer one because the handle's easier, and then I have shorter ones. I would say they're fairly cheap. They usually come in accompaniment with other sewing materials, so you're not normally buying them separately unless you have this like longer one. That's when you're buying it separately. Otherwise, it usually comes along with other things, and I would say keep 2 or 3 around. You're gonna like lose them, misplace them, and you just want to have them accessible to you. I have, like I said, I have 3 of them that I just keep floating around. Then you have your scissors. I have 3 that I use pretty often. And when we get into the cutting, we'll get into more. But you want just your standard pair of scissors that you can use when you're cutting. Nothing too crazy, nothing too fancy, just your standard pair of scissors. If you're noticing a trend, I love pink. So if you're noticing, like, a lot of her materials are pink, I happen to love pink a whole bunch. So I do use pink a lot just to sort of express my personality. So yeah, so we've covered thimble, tape measure, zipper, thread, notions, pins, safety pins, embroidery scissors, needles, our seam ripper, pin cushion, cutting shears, sewing gauge, and buttonhole cutter. So this makes up a basic sewing kit. So if you just wanted to get started, wanted to get kind of like dip your toe in what it takes to build your sewing kit, this is what you need to start with. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe. Videos are uploaded weekly covering dressmaking, fashion, lectures, and more.